let's now look at this last trumpet of God. Using that theme, I'm not just going to leave you in the dark, and neither is Van Kampen. He's going to take now this theme of the blowing of the trumpet, which just a little bit of detail that might be of interest to you. There's a particular Messianic congregation that I'm kind of a long distance member of, in addition to my own local congregation back in Colorado. But this congregation is in Pennsylvania. It's called Beth El Gibor Messianic Congregation, BEG. And a good friend of mine who's in the live class with me right now, he actually is the shofar blower there at the congregation. So he's intimately familiar with this idea of blowing the trumpet in a connection with calling an assembly of the people and alerting us to the activities that God is going to be doing amongst his people. Remember, the trumpet in ancient Israel, the shofar in the Hebrew word, or the I can't remember the Greek word, the salpinx, I think it's called, the metal trumpet. But this particular trumpet in ancient Israel was blown for two primary reasons. One of them was to call an assembly, to gather the troops together, to muster them together to do battle. That the trumpet was used in those purposes. But one of the other significant purposes for the shofar use was to call together or to awaken God's people for religious reasons. The Festival of Trumpets itself, the Feast of Trumpets, which is on the Jewish calendar, shows up named Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year. But the name given in Leviticus 23 is Yom Teruah, and the word Teruah is a reference to one of the trumpet sounds. Right, there's one of the shofar sounds that are blown. The particular style of whether you hold out the blast or whether you make it short and kind of broken up, or whether it's like a 3 blast, or really long. Those sounds are very specific to the way Israel understood God is calling us to assemble together, not for war, but to worship. The trumpet, the Festival of Trumpets itself, is God's clarion call to his people to wake up and be prepared to usher in the return of the king, or the welcoming in of the king himself. Awake, O sleeper, is the theme of the Feast of Trumpets, of Trumpets itself, the Festival of Trumpets. So let's talk about this last trumpet. So my good friend who's in the class right now, I'm not mentioning your name, but I hope you have some insight that you can share with us one of these days, if you're up for it, and I can record it and share it with the rest of my YouTube crowd and stuff. We can talk about what is it like to be a trumpet blower? What's it like to have that anointing on you where God moves through you to blow the trumpet week after week for your Sabbath services and for your festivals, and to play that part of announcing God's presence for his people. Think about that. Maybe we can talk about that in one of these weeks to come. Let's look at Van Kampen's final paragraph here. It's very short. We will finish Van Kampen's notes tonight, and then I've got a summary that I put together, a summary of Robert Van Kampen's notes on the Antichrist that I just kind of cobbled together this week. A summary of what we've just looked at, what we're studying now. So let's look at Van Kampen's final notes here on the trumpet. He talks about the first trumpet of God is prophesied in Zechariah 9:13 through 16 in a near far prophecy which says that, quote, the Lord God will blow the trumpet. Remember, I said the Lord himself blowing it, not an angel, not a seraph, not some other subordinate or something like that, but Lord himself blowing the trumpet. When does he do it? When he would come centuries later to intervene on Israel's behalf against the Greeks and defeat Antiochus. So there's the first trumpet that God blows. And then Van Kampen reminds us, we're reading from the book of the sign, and this is a discussion about the parallels between Antiochus Epiphanes, who lived 200 years before the first century, so 200 years before Christ and the time period of the New Testament, and the parallels between the later man known as Antichrist, who, according to the futurist model of eschatology, is supposed to hit the scene sometime in the future. I think we're very soon, very, very close to his activities. I think He'll probably be making his presence known very, very soon. But Van Kampen talks about the trumpet blowings, first and second trumpet. The second trumpet of God will be blown at the rapture, when the Lord himself will descend from heaven with the trumpet of God. Notice it says the trumpet of God. And we have a reference from Matthew 24:31, as well as 1 Thessalonians 4:16, which we can compare from 1 Corinthians 15:51 and 52. And he does this to deliver the church and to, quote, slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end Antichrist, right? This is Paul writing in the Thessalonian passage. Bring to an end Antichrist by the appearance of his, Christ's, coming, right? That's 2 Thessalonians 2:8. Oftentimes we ask as Christians why the rapture is even needed. Why is God going to rescue us from this, tribulational period that we're talking about, with the blowing of the trumpet and the sound of the shofar and the rapture? Well, there are many themes that are spoken of in the Bible that facilitate understanding of why the rapture would take place and why the trumpet would need to be blown. I mean, there's so many themes. I'm just going to touch on a few of them real quick as I interject. Part of the idea is that God's people, largely during the time when the rapture takes place, are largely going to be in compromise because of the great tribulation and lawlessness of those days that Yeshua talked about, because of the Antichrist's rage and the wrath of Satan that's being poured out on God's people, Jews and Christians who name the name of Yeshua. Because of all of this intense spiritual deception, and because of the what God himself describes as the great delusion that he himself pour out, a lot of God's people are going to be in compromise. They're going to be in what we might call apostasy mode. And so we need the trumpet call. We need the shofar to awaken us as God's people. Even the very elect would be fooled if it were possible. We would even be fooled. We know we're not going to be, because the Spirit of God is going to protect us and preserve us. But at the same time, the church at large needs to be purified. Remember, it's Peter himself that talks about in his first letter about how judgment beginning at the house of God, and about the intense trial that befalls you. So don't be alarmed by these things, because the testing has to be poured out on the whole world and on God's people in specifically, so that God can waken them up to prepare his bride for his return. So the whole theme of this crucible, this refining, not just of Israel, but of the church, right? God's refining his natural lineage of Abraham, which is the Jewish people, national Israel, but God's also refining and purging and purifying the spiritual line of Abraham, which is the Gentile church at large. So the trumpet has to be blown in order to wake up God's people. Remember that theme of the Feast of Trumpets, awake, O sleeper, right? The trumpet is blown to wake us up to the fact that God is coming. The King is approaching. Get ready. Get yourself ready, right? Get your garments ready. Get your life in order, right? Settle your accounts, as it were. And so at the same time, one of the themes of the rapture is the rescue of the righteous from the wicked Antichrist himself, right? God is not going to just let his people be slaughtered without any mercy. He's going to step in and intervene. And so the rapture cuts short the wrath of Satan in that regard. So that's why Paul says that the blowing of the trumpet and the rapture are going to slay the Antichrist, and Yeshua is going to do this with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end Antichrist by the appearance. The word appearance there is parousia. The second coming is what we're referring to, of his appearance, or of his coming. And then in this last paragraph, Van Kampen reminds us that in a remarkable way, this prefigures what will happen after the end of the 70th week. What's going to happen is 45 days after the defeat of Antichrist. So we'll bring up the little chart again that shows the 70th week. I'll do this in post-production. Those of you with me in the class just have to pretend like you're seeing a chart. But when you look at the 70th week, from at the beginning of the 7th week, the 7-year time period, that's when Antichrist signs the peace treaty. That's when the beginning of the seals is broken by Yeshua himself. So the first seal is the white horse rider. That's Antichrist himself. That's the beginning. as we move from left to right, looking at this chart, in the middle of the week, the 7-year period, there's the what we call the abomination, desolation. The midpoint of the week, Antichrist takes off his disguise, reveals who he is to Israel. The rest of the world finds out who he is at that point in time as well. And the intense persecution, the great tribulation, you could say, starts at that point in time. The occupation of Jerusalem. Israel, the Israelis at the time who are in and near Jerusalem are told by Yeshua to flee, etc., etc. But as we look at the far right side of the chart, the end of the 70th week, the 7 years itself, there's this what we might call 30-day reclamation period and 45-day restoration period. Well, if we tack on those 2 extra days at the end of the 70th week, which are spoken of by Daniel himself, well, then we see the time for the rededication of the land of Israel in that particular part. Jerusalem, the temple was in ruins because of what Antichrist had already done. Jerusalem itself is already in ruins because of all the intense campaigns, the Jerusalem campaign, the Armageddon campaign, etc., etc. I mean, the land of Israel is a mess. Jesus comes back and has to rebuild and establish his temple there. This time it'll be the Ezekiel temple. And this is a temple that's going to last for at least 1,000 years. Well, this is the 45 days after the defeat of Antichrist that Van Kampen is referring to right here. He continues, "For as will be shown in greater detail in chapter 22 of his book, and the epilogue, in those days the redeemed nation of Israel will once again observe Hanukkah in a unique and resplendent way this time," right? So we're talking about after the Antichrist has been defeated and after Jesus has already returned. This is in parallel to what happened in the days of Antiochus, right? What happened? Antiochus went through Jerusalem, ravaged the temple, defiled it, right, with the pig offering and the pig's blood, or pig urine, or I'm not sure exactly which historical account is accurate. You can go back and read through Maccabees or read through Josephus, etc., etc. And after the temple was defiled and looted and all of that, but Antiochus himself was driven out eventually, right? He went with his tail between his legs back to his home, back somewhere in Syria, I believe, where he eventually died of a disease. But the point in the story is that after the Maccabees kicked his butt, right, what happened? They had to clean up the mess and rededicate the temple. Well, that's a parallel to what's going to happen in the future. Antichrist is going to go blast through Israel. He's going to desecrate the temple. He's going to make things a mess there. But eventually, he's going to get his butt kicked by Jesus himself, and then the temple is going to have to be rededicated. So this time of unique and resplendent dedication and remembrance of what does Van Kampen say, of the defeat of Antichrist. So we'll have a Hanukkah like no other Hanukkah on that day, because now we not only have defeated Antiochus, which is what the current Hanukkah celebrations commemorate, the defeat of Antiochus Epiphanes, but what we will also have in the future is an even greater Hanukkah celebration as we now commemorate the defeat of Antichrist himself. And so Van Kampen reminds us that in celebration of the rebuilding of the temple, not just by the Maccabean family this time, but by Christ himself, and in recognition of the permanent return, not the temporary, but the permanent return of God's glory to his temple. And that will be of most joyous celebration during that time. Wouldn't you have to agree? I mean, in the first Hanukkah celebration, it was primarily Jewish people who were celebrating because God had liberated them from this wicked despot ruler known as Antiochus Epiphanes, and allowed them to have the victory and to reestablish the temple, to get it cleansed, and to take control of their own land and their own religious observances, etc., etc. So it was a great celebration for the Jewish people, but there weren't any really Christians on the scene to participate. But this time, I can imagine, as the greater Hanukkah takes place at the end of the 70th week of Daniel, at the end of that 7-year time period when Antichrist is defeated by Yeshua, and the rededication of the temple takes place, and Yeshua begins to rebuild his temple for the millennial 1,000-year time period. At this time, not just Jewish people will be celebrating, because number one, their Messiah will be there, and the blinders will be lifted, and all Israel will now recognize who he is, right? This will be a time of Israel's salvation. Remember, Daniel was promised very early on in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, that there's these 6 things that God will accomplish for Daniel's people and for the temple and for the land of Israel and for the people. And one of those things was the salvation of Israel, the bringing in of everlasting righteousness among Israel, and the final atonement for national Israel, where they recognize this one whom they pierced, and they mourn for him as one mourns for an only son, like Zechariah chapter 14 describes. So Israel will be celebrating not just the rededication of the temple at this greater Hanukkah, but also celebrating finally the acceptance of their true Messiah, Yeshua himself. But guess what? Christians will be there as well this time. And so finally, Christians and Jews will have a chance to celebrate this one great Hanukkah, right? And we'll have a chance to blow our shofars and celebrate together. So essentially, that will do it for the look at Robert Van Kampen's chapter on the Antichrist. There's a lot more in the book. I only skimmed the surface. There's so much more that I could have hit if this were a book study itself, but it isn't. So I encourage you to go out and get the book. I do endorse it. I have it sitting on my shelf right now. I'm looking at it right now. Get the 3rd edition, right? That's the final edition that was put out around the year 2000. Just before Mr. Van Kampen passed away, went to be with the Lord himself. But the 3rd edition is the one you want to get of the sign. I'll flash a little screen grab Amazon. This is not an affiliate link or anything. I'm not getting any what do you call it, pushbacks or any benefit from endorsing the book. I'm just endorsing it because it's a great book. So go ahead and pick up the book, The Sign by Robert Van Kampen. It's kind of a black cover. Great book, eschatology book, but the footnote there shows that this was pulled from the Sign Updated Edition, Crossway 2000, pages 144 through 151. What I want to do now, let me look at my time. Give me a second here. Checking something. Oh yeah, I've got lots of time. Let me check my volume. That looks good as well. All right. What I want to do real quick is now, since we've been looking at Mr. Van Kampen's notes for a few weeks, let's go back and look at a summary of where we went, where we came from. I put together this summary this week. It's not very long, it's just a few paragraphs, and we'll easily be able to get through all of this. And this will kind of park us at being ready to begin to have this discussion in topic number 7 about the Antichrist according to Joel Richardson, and Excursus on that. Largely, we've been talking about what we might call the European model of the Antichrist, where he emerges out of maybe a revived, what we call Roman Empire, Western version of Rome model. Maybe he's more what we might consider either Gentile resembling type of Antichrist. But if we pour through the prophecies of Scripture, we're going to find eventually that there's a lot of details that could lend support to a different theory that the Antichrist is going to rise up out of some sort of Arabic type country, maybe an Islamic type model, a revived Ottoman Empire instead of a revived Roman, which would kind of still fit the extension of Rome, but on the east side, right, from Istanbul's side of the map, eastern side of Rome, which was eventually overtaken by the Ottoman Empire 1,000 years later. Anyway, so that's next week, if my schedule lines up and if all of the green lights fall into place. I'm still got some red tape I need to cut through on my end, but if we can get all that put together, then that's what we're going to be looking at. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that. Very fascinating study, if I may say so myself.